If you've been reading with us through Kings and Chronicles, you've probably noticed something that jumps out at you: the temple. The temple seems to come up over and over and over in both Kings and Chronicles, but maybe especially in Chronicles. Kings repair the temple, prophets warn about the temple, reforms center around the temple, worship happens around the temple, of course. And again, that begs a question: what's so important about the temple? You have to understand, the temple's not just a building, it is an identity. The temple represents something really important in Scripture, and that is God's desire to live among his people. Welcome, everybody, back to Side Questions. We answer the questions that come up while you're reading the Bible. Now, after God rescued Israel from Egypt, brought them out of Egypt, while they were wandering in the wilderness, he said, I want you to build me a tabernacle. This is in Exodus 25 and following. God gave Moses the plans to build an elaborate tent with all kinds of elaborate furnishings. And God said, this is where I will be. It became this physical manifestation of God dwelling with his people. And we had priests, and we had sacrifices, and we had holy spaces. So there were limitations. This wasn't the garden where God physically walked along with Adam and Eve and they had conversations. This was now a again, divided kind of system. Sin was still a problem. Sin still created a divide, but this symbolized again now that God was with his people. Eventually, the people settle into the land, and eventually David comes along and becomes this great king, and David was given the plans to build a permanent house for God. We call the temple, the first temple. And so David didn't actually build it. His son Solomon actually built it. And it's this extremely elaborate building with gold and bronze and silver and special furnishings. It's modeled after the tabernacle, but it's much larger, much more elegant and permanent in Jerusalem. So now Jerusalem and the temple become this icon, this symbol of Israel's identity. But even still, this is the seat of God. He literally sits on the throne in the mercy seat on the ark in the temple, but there's still this divide. But this is still the center of everything. Worship happens here. Sacrifices happen here. Prayers take place here. The singers are playing here and singing here. The promises kind of all center now around Jerusalem. The festivals are all to happen in Jerusalem. So this becomes the center. And so now we have a permanent dwelling place for God, but it is still divided. It is still under the influence of sin. And so there's literally a veil between the two rooms, just like there was in the tent. Temple worship represented covenant faithfulness, and unfortunately, Israel didn't do so well. The kingdom split for various reasons. The northern kingdom, Israel, built altars to the Lord, but they weren't in Jerusalem. The king there, in what might be a savvy political move, decided he didn't want all of his people going back to Jerusalem, which was in the southern kingdom of Judah now, and worshiping. So he built Dan and Bethel, or these idols, and said, this is how we'll worship God. That, of course, is not acceptable. They never recover from that. Ultimately, Israel is destroyed by the Assyrians and sent off into captivity. And so that leaves Judah. They don't have a much better track record, but they did have the temple. And there were a few restorations, as we mentioned earlier, Hezekiah and Josiah in particular. But ultimately, they too could not keep the faithful covenant to God. They didn't worship the way they were supposed to. And so Judah is destroyed in captivity as well by the Babylonians. Only this time, the temple is destroyed. It is burned down and completely stripped of all its valuables. It is gone. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the entire city. So there's nothing left. So suddenly, the identity is gone. Suddenly, the seat where God sat was gone. And basically, that means God's presence is gone. And all hope seemed lost. But that's not how God works, fortunately. God always brings hope. And so there's a prophet named Ezekiel who early on in the exile prophesied about a future temple. Now, this temple's not one that's going to be built. It's a vision of God's presence returning in the future. Because out of this temple comes a river. And it starts small, but then it gets bigger and bigger. And wherever this water goes, life is restored. Plants grow, animals thrive, people thrive. Even the Dead Sea is described as coming back to life. And this represents God's presence. And so when God's presence is there, then life grows. That's why we have all of this abundance language in the prophets, especially those later prophets. The prophets use language like the mountains would drip with wine. Again, plants would grow and thrive and produce huge amounts of food. The people, the flocks would grow. This is language that people in that day would have understood. I believe if prophets spoke today, they would use different language to tell us the same point, that there would be abundance, that things would be good when God's presence existed. But then something happens when Jesus comes on the scene. Jesus in John 2 told the people, the leadership, you destroy this temple and I will raise it up in 3 days. And he wasn't talking about the current temple that they had. It had been restored and rebuilt partially. But Jesus was talking about himself, his body. So a really important change happens when Jesus comes on the scene. He is the temple. And so what we have in this long story to get us to where Jesus is, and we've been talking about this in some of our other videos, we've been looking for the perfect priest, the perfect king, the perfect prophet, and the perfect temple. And all of that comes together in the person of Jesus. So now Jesus comes to earth. This is God in the flesh. He is the temple. God is again walking with humanity. But the story doesn't end there. It continues. It doesn't end with Jesus. It begins with Jesus coming, or the change begins with Jesus coming, but it continues with the church. Paul says something remarkable in 1 Corinthians 3, writing to the church. He says, you are the temple of God. You are where God dwells. And so we now have this real expression of, through the Spirit, God dwelling with his people. The church is now God's people. And so, and in part, the temple, Jesus is the temple. He's described as the head. It's described as a kingdom. It's described as a priesthood. Again, all of those things that we've been talking about. And so we now comprise this temple. We are literally the temple. We are part of the temple, and God dwells with us. And this comes full circle when you get to the book of Revelation. And among all of these visions and descriptions that John has, at the end, he sees a new heaven and new earth, and he sees a city, and that city, and he notes there is no temple there. And the reason is because God again dwells directly with his people and walks with his people. So we're not quite there yet. We're in the kingdom, in the new temple, in all of this, but we're not quite at that finish line. It's sort of an already but not yet situation. And so will there be a third temple? The temple that Jesus worshiped in was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70, and there has not been one rebuilt since. And even if there is one rebuilt, that's not the temple that Ezekiel was prophesying about. That's certainly not the temple that Jesus is, and that's not the temple that is the church. So there's more to it than just simply building another building there on that site in Jerusalem, which may or may not happen. So the temple story is a long one. It's all throughout Scripture. Eden, the tabernacle, the temple in Jerusalem, the church, Jesus, the new creation, where there won't be a temple because, again, God dwells with us. That's the point. The temple represents God's desire to dwell with his people. It's not about architecture. It's not about a location. It's about God dwelling with his people, and even more precisely, God's people being able to dwell with God.